We live in a world of skepticism. We often live by the phrase, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And when you hear that, you kind of nod your head and go, yeah, I'm going to agree with that, because we have been burned. We have been burned time and time again, whether it's an infomercial that promises the world and maybe you bought that product, whether it was a Ginsu knife, or maybe it was the Thigh Master that's still in your closet. You know, those kinds of things, well, they lead us to believe if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And if it's not one of those things, maybe it's something a little more serious. Maybe it's somebody that promised they'd be there for you, and when things got tough and they fell apart, they were nowhere to be found. Coming back to, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So for many people, when you hear that, your response is, when they're telling you the world, your response is, sure, yeah, okay, and then you move on with life. In our broken world today, this is our human condition. Now, just last Sunday, we began to discuss something that's quite amazing, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, what we often call Easter Sunday or Resurrection Sunday, which is quite an amazing thing to believe. And sometimes people's response to that on the surface is, yeah, okay, sure. And what we began to discuss, and the key issue from last week, was the angel's interaction to the women who came to the tomb, only to find it empty. And the angel said to the women, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" It's a great question to really examine our own lives of why do we look for life among things that cannot give it. We're going to pick up where we left off last week, where the ladies left the tomb and went back to the disciples, the remaining 11 disciples, and watch the interaction between the women, their testimony, and what the disciples' response to that is. This is found in Luke chapter 24, beginning at verse 9. It says, "When they came back from the tomb," meaning the women, "they told all these things to the 11 and all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. When the women told the disciples what they had experienced, that Jesus wasn't there, the angel had said to them, the recollection that Jesus was going to be raised from the dead, when the angels reminded that to them, notice the response of the disciples found in verse 11. They did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Nonsense literally means idle talk. Now, think about that for a second. In a time of mourning, what kind of person, or in this case, what kind of people would have idle talk or nonsensical talk when one of your closest friends passes away and you're going to speak idle words about that to the people that are mourning his loss just the same? Who would do that? I'm not really sure. So even just from that perspective, what they were sharing was had to be something real, something that meant something to them. And now, in defense of the disciples, the reality that Jesus is alive, that's really a pretty amazing truth, as we shared before. And on the surface, the fact that Jesus is alive, it does sound like nonsense. It does sound hard to believe. The response to Jesus' resurrection, this particular response to Jesus' resurrection is not limited to just the disciples. This is a common response when you tell people that Jesus is still alive. This was even an issue for the early church. Listen to what Paul tells the church in Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness." So the message of Jesus dying and being raised back to life is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The truth, Jesus is alive, and he is still transforming lives, even yet today. Oftentimes that's seen as foolishness. Oftentimes that's seen as nonsense. It's still true today. And if you're a follower of Jesus, I have a guess. And my guess is this, that you have shared the life-changing power of Jesus, what he has done in your life, and the response that you got was a lot like the response the disciples gave the women. You shared what Jesus has done in your life and how he has transformed your life, and the response that you received from the person you have shared that with, well, may have been, yeah, that's nonsense. That's foolish. I don't believe you. Or maybe it was not quite that harsh. Maybe it was something a little more like this. Okay, great, whatever works for you. Or, I'm glad for you. But in other words, don't try to put that on me. Either way, that response is the same as the disciples. That response is the same as many around the early church. A dead man that came back to life and imparts new life to people today, yeah, that's kind of a hard one to believe. Sounds like nonsense, sounds like foolishness, sounds too good to be true that this man, this God-man, died, was raised to life, and that when we trust in him, we can be forgiven, guilt and condemnation can be taken away. Yeah, that sounds too good to be true. But what I don't want you to miss, and what I want you to hear this morning is this: to not be discouraged. To not be discouraged when you share the testimony of what God has done in your life, when you share what he is doing in your life, and you get a response like that, that's foolishness, that's nonsense, or if that works for you, that's great. I want you to notice what does happen then in at least one of the disciples' lives. Verse 12 of Luke chapter 24, it says this: Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying there by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. But Pete checked it out. After he heard that, after they just told what they saw, heard, and knew, eventually he said, I need to go check that out. He dug a little bit deeper. He saw the evidence for himself of the empty tomb because of the testimony of the women. They did their job, and then they let God do the rest. The early church kept pressing on through the general response of many that this is foolishness. So it wasn't just Peter, but even the early church kept pressing on as the world around them said, that's foolishness. How can I be so sure? I can be so sure because there's still followers of Jesus today. Matter of fact, more now than then. So of course they kept pressing on, even when people told them that's foolish. Some had to think about it, come back and check Jesus out for themselves. You see, what Christ does in the life of a person that is chosen to believe in him is life-giving and transformative. And those around you may push back and say it's nonsense or foolish, but some, like Peter, eventually, and the rest of the disciples, will check it out for themselves. What I want you to hear today is this: do not be discouraged. Do not be discouraged. Do not grow weary. Live out your faith. Pray for those that push back and say, yeah, that's a little too much for me. That's nonsense or that's foolish. And let the words that Jesus spoke into your life, to the transformative power in your life, be real to you and continue to allow him to transform you as a testimony to the world around you.